Clothing didn't get cheaper because it got easier to make. I want to be very clear about the fact that clothing got cheaper because production was exported to places where labor was cheaper and it was exponentially less protected. So let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is historical labor and cost. Wow. Considering people's labor. I know we don't do that anymore, but we're going to do it for this video. In the early to mid 20th century, clothing represented weeks of wages. Fabric was expensive and labor was skilled. Construction actually mattered also. The expectation was longevity, not novelty. The drop in clothing prices didn't come from innovation alone. It came from offshoring labor, wage suppression, deregulation, and environmental externalization. We didn't get cheaper clothes, we got hidden costs. So let me just touch on those aspects and break down what that actually means in terms of this shift and what this represented. So we're really talking about this post-war period and this aspect of globalization that has touched really all aspects of our life, from fashion, music, film, and even the food industry. But I just want to talk about what this actually means for this concept of clothing and what it actually costs. So let's talk about what offshoring means in plain language. Hopefully this is plain. So offshoring is the relocation of manufacturing from higher wage countries like the United States to lower wage countries to reduce production costs. In fashion, this meant moving garment production from the United States and Europe to countries in Asia, Latin America, and eventually Africa. In these areas, labor was cheaper and protections are much weaker. So this is actually the single biggest reason that clothing became cheap. Wages dropped dramatically, labor standards were easier to bypass, and brands could scale production faster and cheaper. I do want to clarify before we go further in this conversation that though I do believe there are many aspects of cheap production and labor that are they're just not producing good quality products. I do want to be also very considerate of the fact that this is still being produced by people's labor, their time, their energy, and they're often being compensated next to nothing. And so I do think it is important that while we really maybe create higher standards for ourselves in terms of the clothes that we are purchasing and that we're curating, I do think it is important to be mindful of a lot of the isms, and I'm not going to go into all of the isms, but all of the isms that are at play that goes into perpetuating this idea that because fast fashion is producing cheap clothing, that the labor attached to it is cheap. Okay, so I'm going to figure out how I want to say this. I think that though fast fashion often results in very cheaply and mass-produced products that aren't always of the highest quality, I do think it is very important to not conflate a cheap product with cheaply valuing the time, energy, and labor that a lot of people have put into producing these products. Often thousands of products a day. And I think that sometimes from a removed perspective, I think it can be very easy to critique fast fashion as something that doesn't have human labor attached to it. And sometimes I think a lot of the emphasis ends up being rooted in a focus on what we are receiving and the pieces that we're receiving and the quality of the pieces, the craftsmanship, the level of skill. But I often feel like a lot of those conversations leave out the fact that people are making these clothes in often terrible conditions to support their families with next to no compensation and systems that are wildly unchecked, even more than ours. And I think sometimes it can feel a little frustrating when, and I think these are valid critiques of fast fashion and cheap clothing, I do think it can feel a little frustrating that not enough of us are centering the fact that there's still people that made these items, and in very terrible conditions, with very unrealistic and unfair expectations about how many they're supposed to be producing by the hour. And I do think it's important as we move forward in this conversation to always center the reality that human labor is at the center of every aspect of exploitation when it comes to this topic. And so I do want to just take a moment to remind us of that when we are maybe picking apart the quality and craftsmanship. Just because those aspects aren't always there does not mean that there's not the same amount, and if not more, because mass consumption is at a completely different level. But yeah, I just don't want us to minimize the reality that there is still very much labor and hands that are creating these garments. So I'll just leave that there. So a lot of this did really accelerate after World War II and really just took off between the 70s and the 90s, which is where you're also going to find that a lot of the quality of vintage clothes really starts to decrease and decline. This is also heavily driven by trade agreements and this aspect of corporate globalization that was really picking up steam during this time. So in 1965, about 95% of the clothing that was sold in the United States was made domestically. In the 1990s, this figure decreased to less than 10%. Clothing didn't get cheaper because it got easier to make. I want to be very clear about the fact that clothing got cheaper because production was exported to places where labor was cheaper and it was exponentially less protected. There is a really great article that was published by the the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that article really focuses on the apparel manufacturing decline. And there's also a really great article which is written by Pietra Rivoli. I really hope I'm not butchering the name, but it's called The Travels of a T-shirt in the Global Economy, and that was written, or at least published, in 2005. There's also a really great report by the World Trade Report that sort of talks about sort of the state of textiles and apparel. So those are all great resources that I will link below that you should definitely check out. So I want to move into this concept of wage suppression. So what does that actually mean? So wage suppression is the intentional keeping of wages low despite rising productivity and profits. In garment production, this often happens through weak labor laws, union suppression, we've been seeing a lot of that with Starbucks recently, informal labor systems, and gendered labor. So thinking about garment work disproportionately employing women. So why does this actually matter in terms of fashion? Garment workers often earn below living wages. They're often paid per piece, not per hour, and they often absorb production risk. So that is including slowdowns, any defects, and any drops in demand. Cheap clothing depends on workers being paid less than the value of their labor. I do want to emphasize that a lot of this issue and a lot of the issues that we talk about come back to the reality that it's not the products that are actually being undervalued. A lot of the issue is the fact that the labor isn't being valued, and often it's just not being considered at all. Today, most garment workers earn between 30 to 60% of a living wage, and raises are lagging much further behind inflation. This isn't just for garment workers, but this is what we're talking about here, so I'm going to focus on them. But another thing to consider is often safety standards are rarely enforced. Deregulation. So, what does that mean? Deregulation is the removal or weakening of government rules that protects workers, consumers, and the environment. In fashion, deregulation reduces the oversight of factories, weakens labor protections, and allows corporations to self-regulate. And a lot of companies have pushed for this. For them, this means that there are fewer inspections, they have lower compliance costs, and they have faster production timelines. So, to put it plainly, the cost of savings have gone directly to corporations, not workers. And then we've really reached this historical turning point around the 80s and 90s, and this is where you really start to see a lot of neoliberal economic policies start to emerge. You really start to see the decline of unions, as well as this shift towards free trade models, which, obviously we are contending with a lot of the recent tariff implementations, but, you know, um, uh, um, environmental externalization. So what does that mean? Environmental externalization is when companies shift environmental damage away from themselves and onto communities, ecosystems, and future generations without paying for the harm that they cause. I think one great way to think about this, which a lot of us have at the forefront of our minds right now, and I don't want to get into a whole conversation about AI, but a lot of people are starting to really feel the effects of a lot of the AI data centers. And these AI data centers have pushed a lot of the costs of maintaining them onto the surrounding communities. And so this is still very prevalent in the fashion industry and thinking about the labor that is involved, but also the waste that is produced by these factories. But how does fashion do this? So there's a few different ways. I'm just going to highlight some of the biggest ways that this happens. But this happens with water pollution from dyeing, toxic chemical runoff, textile waste in landfills, and carbon emissions from global shipping. These are costs that are not reflected in the price of the clothing. And this makes clothing look much more affordable than it truly is. Imagine if companies had to pay for safe waste disposal, clean water, and their carbon impact. I think we can all imagine how dramatically the cost of these prices would increase. Fast fashion is only affordable because the environmental damage is treated as someone else's problem, but it's all of our problem. Vintage exposes this because it comes from a time when these costs were still visible. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, by the mid-1990s, less than 10% of clothing sold in the United States was still being made domestically, compared to nearly all of it being produced domestically in the 1960s. This wasn't a gradual change, it was a systemic relocation of labor. According to the International Labor Organization, most garment workers globally earn less than a living wage, even when working full-time. The ILO has consistently found that garment workers' wages often cover only a fraction of basic living costs in major manufacturing countries. According to political economist David Harvey, the shift towards deregulation and free market policies in the late 20th century significantly weakened labor protections while increasing corporate power. Labor protections weakened, oversight increasingly shifted from governments to corporations themselves. According to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, the fashion industry is one of the most resource-intensive and polluting industries globally, with most environmental costs not reflected in the price of clothing. The foundation estimates that the fashion industry consumes vast amounts of water and energy while externalizing waste and pollution onto communities and ecosystems. I think what this boils down to is a cultural amnesia that we're all experiencing. When something is cheap for long enough, we start to believe that it's natural. But cheap clothing is an anomaly. It's not a tradition. And I love that when we really think about vintage, it sort of exists as evidence of this. I mean, vintage, it just reminds us of this because it survives. I mean, they outlast trends, seasons, time, and often the bodies that wear them. So I think that when we think about this concept of clothing being affordable or previously being more affordable, I think what we really mean is that we've really stopped seeing who's paid the price. Anywho, that was a bit of an intense topic, but it's some food for thought, and I definitely would love to hear what you have to say and what you think about this topic. Hopefully, it didn't sound too negative or pessimistic. I just wanted to create a moment of remembering some of the things that I don't think we're talking about. So let me know what you think, and I will see you soon. Bye.